Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. Apologies for the late start, obviously getting a few people involved. Everyone has to get home and get back to their locations. Welcome, as I say, we're really glad that we could put this webinar on. We know there's been a huge interest in the vaccines and particularly how it will relate to MS, immune systems in general, and also disease modifying therapies. So I want to thank everyone for joining, and also obviously we're holding this event in acknowledgement of World MS Day, which was just on Sunday. And we know that there's 2.8 million people worldwide with MS, and 4,000 of those are here in New Zealand. So it's a great opportunity to come together, acknowledge and provide connections and advocacy. So this is a wonderful opportunity. Thank you. We knew this webinar would be of interest to a lot of people. But we were slightly overwhelmed with the amount of registrations. We've had over 230 for tonight, and almost 200 people have asked for the recording as well separately. So thank you very much for your interest. I also want to really thank the Ministry of Health, Audrey and Ray, who are here representing the Ministry, who are co-hosting this event with us. There's obviously a lot of interest to know about when vaccines will be available. A lot of that will be discussed later and how that will happen. It was great to hear at the end of last week, the Ministry have acknowledged that people with MS who are able to get the flu or influenza vaccine publicly funded are also then able to get the COVID vaccine through Group 3. Some Group 3 work has begun, I believe, and most DHBs are still working through Group 2. So more of this will be touched on by Ray and Audrey later in the webinar. I also want to then just mention about how the format of today will work. Obviously, we have our two speakers, David and Ray, and Audrey will be involved with the Ministry of Health session. We're going to hold most questions until the panel session after the speakers, and then everyone will be able to answer the questions as appropriate. We will also be having, hopefully, Dr. John Mottershead from Southern DHB, who's a specialist MS neurologist, joining us, who hopefully will be able to answer some questions from a more clinical perspective from New Zealand. And we may be having another representative coming through from the Ministry as well. So I would, just before I introduce our first speaker, I would just like to hand over to Audrey Isbister. So Audrey is the Deputy Director General for Disability at the Ministry of Health, and obviously has been very heavily involved in the rollout aspects for the sector. Audrey.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you, Amanda Rose. And I think I want to thank everybody for their time and commitment to this really important webinar. But in particular, I just want to thank you, Amanda Rose, for facilitating and organising this. You may or may not know that the Ministry of Health has an engagement group, and we meet regularly, and Amanda Rose is part of this. And this is so that we have the contact that we need to have in communication and consultation with our community to ensure that we're doing the right thing, because this is a new thing for New Zealand, for the whole world, what we're doing in terms of rolling out a vaccine strategy, and your feedback is most important to us. Our engagement group primarily focuses on the Group 3 that Amanda Rose just spoke about. They're people throughout New Zealand over 65 and older, and those with the relevant underlying health conditions, and disabled people, as well as adults in custodial type settings. So we're really pleased to see that is underway with many DHBs. And one of the things that Beth has actually, she sent me through some statistics this afternoon. I'll just quickly go through them. Quite useful to know that as at the 20th, we have administered, 20th of May, I should say, administered 505,000 doses of the vaccine. Initially, it took 49 days to reach 100,000 doses. Then it took 2 weeks to reach 200,000 to get to, and then 12 days to get to 300,000, and then 8 days to hit 400,000. So as you can see, we are ramping it up. We are, as we said, vaccinating people in group 3. And if you're in that group, you should be contacted directly by your DHB, and we'll talk a bit more about that soon. But as of this week, and I thought my daughter is actually doing this, she's a nurse practitioner, we have 5,358 vaccinators that are working through New Zealand and training. So we think we've got a handle on it, and we're really, really pleased. But what I'm most pleased about is something like tonight, because we're working and we want to be working collaboratively with our community, and this is all part of it. So thanks, Amanda Rose. I will get it back to you as chair of the meeting.
Thank you. So I'm trying to get I'm breaking up my internet issues sorted out at the moment. But I'd just like to introduce now Professor David Tscharke. So David is he's a MS researcher. He is head of immunology and infectious diseases at the John Curtin School of Medical Research, which is the Australian school based in Canberra. David is also a person with MS, and he was diagnosed over 10 years ago, which led him to develop his research into MS. And he has recently been awarded an MS Research Australia incubator grant, looking to know if medication is effective or not before a relapse occurs. So there's some very interesting work coming out of Canberra. We'll be following that with interest. But obviously today our main topic is around the COVID vaccines, and I will hand over to David.
Will remember to unmute himself before he starts talking. Okay, so it's a real pleasure to be with you from across the pond. Just a couple of things. So this is going to be very immunology heavy, and I guess the way I've come across this or about this, I've done a number of talks, some in the MS community and some outside, about COVID vaccines. And my approach has been is that often when people understand the biology of these vaccines and how they work, a lot of the misinformation, a lot of the questions that they have about what's going on actually get answered. So this is going to be a bit of a lecture. Now, I also know that a lot of people with MS are really engaged and have a pretty good level of understanding about the biology and stuff. Other people, not so much. And so what I've tried to do is give something for everyone here. So I've got some take-home messages for those who don't get into the biology so much, but I've tried to have enough depth for people who really have spent a lot of time thinking about it, that they don't go, oh yeah, I've heard all this. Yeah, we'll see how we go. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this is going to come off okay. And I tend to draw on my slides. I hope that style is not too annoying for people. All right, can you see my screen? You can wave, Amanda? Yep, okay. So you can buy socks these days already that show you how great the COVID vaccine is. I just need to crank up my pen. Okay, there we go. So there's my socks. These are officially called Run COVID Run, which are great. They were given to me by someone leaving my laboratory. So I'm going to dive straight in right now and talk about how the immune system works, because when you know how the immune system works, we know how vaccine works. So the immune system kind of works in 4 or 5 main ways. I'll just go through those quickly. So number one, things like your skin are part of your immune system, and they essentially block bad things from getting in. It's pretty straightforward, easy to understand, not very interesting from the point of view of an immunologist. So that's the last I'm going to say, but it is really important that the reason we don't get sick most of the time is that most microbes can't get in. The second thing the immune system needs to do is it has to respond to danger and damage. I'm going to explain this a little bit more, but there are chemical warning signals that your body makes, and there's also a whole set of your white blood cells that get activated. So that's number one thing that happens. The next thing that happens that's really quite unique for all vertebrates, so animals, is that we're able to raise a pathogen-specific army. Again, these are specialized white blood cells. Often they're called lymphocytes. And this happens during infection, and these are the main foot soldiers that clear a microbial infection in your body. After the infection has occurred, though, most of this army needs to stand down and clean up. However, really importantly, there is a legacy of protection that's left behind, and this is what we call immune memory. So I'm going to go through that in much more detail now to show you the various players. Right, but first we just have to talk about the fact that our bodies are really well organized and orderly machines. All right, so this is a reminder that underneath our skin, our body is made up of lots and lots of tiny cells. All of these cells have different functions. Some are muscle cells, some are brain cells, but they all work rather much the same way. Okay, so the doing machines in your cells are nearly all made of different sorts of proteins, and those proteins have to be encoded somewhere in your DNA. That's what the DNA is for. It's the code for all of the things that your different cells need to do. That DNA is important, and it is in every single one of your cells, but it is in the nucleus of your cells. So it's locked away in a special part of your cell where it gets kept safe. Now, that DNA, that's the famous double helix. It looks like this. And if you want to release the code for a particular protein you need to make in your cell, you don't use the DNA itself. You make a copy of that in a slightly different chemical, which is called mRNA. Right? So that's the first time you're going to hear that word, but obviously that's going to be really important later. Right, so mRNA is a single helix, and it's a slightly different chemical to DNA, and it gets shipped out of the nucleus and it goes into a factory in another part of your cell, and that makes lots of proteins. So that's how your cells work. It's all very orderly. It's the same in every one of your cells. When you need to make a new protein, the code is read off your DNA genome. It's made into a similar molecule called mRNA, and that goes off to a factory to inform how a protein needs to be made. Okay, so that's your cells all working properly. So what's the first thing that the immune system does? Actually, every cell in your body you can consider to be an immune part of your immune system, because every cell can detect when things are not in the right place. So here's a cell at the moment where everything is in the right place. Your DNA is in the nucleus, there is mRNA, and that can be in the nucleus or it can be out here as well. However, viruses do messy things in cells. So some viruses, for example, will put DNA out here where it's out of the nucleus. It's not supposed to be there, and your cell knows that it's not supposed to be there. Some other viruses, instead of having mRNA, they actually have RNA that is a double helix like this. Okay, that is another thing that should never be in your cell. Okay, so that's another bad thing. And finally, a lot of bacterial and other sorts of microbes, they actually have parts of their wall and parts of their bacterial their cells that are completely different to anything that is in your body. So if any of that comes in contact or gets inside one of your cells know that that's wrong. Okay, and when your cell knows something is wrong, it will do largely one of three things. Firstly, it could send warning signals out depending on what sort of cell it is. Some cells will just die quietly. Again, if something is bad happening in a cell, you just want it to go away. There's lots of other cells, so you can afford to lose one or two. So it might die quietly. Alternatively, some cells will die spectacularly, and that is to warn all of the tissue around that something bad is happening. Right, so those signals will be going to some specialized white blood cells. Now, I'm going to say a whole lot of big words here, but in the end, what you need to understand is that these are white blood cells that will come out of your bloodstream. They'll go into a place where there's infection, you know, maybe you've got a sore throat or something, and they respond to those signals and start the business of fighting infection. So we've got things called neutrophils. These are really, they're kind of the dumb soldier grunts, if you like. They rush in, they burst open, they make a mess. They're really important, but they don't do anything very specific. You have other cells which are called macrophages. Literally, it means big eater. These are kind of like Pac-Man cells. They chew up stuff that's bad, they get rid of it. Okay. There's another special type of cell that's going to come up a bit more. We call them a dendritic cell. Okay, what these cells do is they collect the stuff around, they collect debris, stuff that's bad, they get activated by the warning system, and they go to a special place in your body called lymph nodes, which I'm going to explain. Right, but all of these signals and cells, this is what causes inflammation. Okay, anytime you have, you know, you get a red sore throat, that's inflammation, that's all of this stuff going on. Right, so The next important part of our immune system to understand is the lymphatic system. I mean, everyone understands we have blood, which, and we've got our veins and our arteries, but what we kind of forget is that our bodies also have like a stormwater drain system, if you like, and that's our lymphatic system. And what that allows the body to do is, when there is extra fluid, it can drain out of your tissues, whether it's your throat here, maybe you've got a sore throat, and it can go into lymph nodes from there. This is really important because it allows us to take things from any site in the body and go to a special place where the immune system can ask, is there something bad happening? Do I need to make more of a response? So fluid between our cells and our tissues is drained into the lymph with any debris that's there. Some immune cells also can follow the lymph, and these dendritic cells that I told you about, they're like outpost sentries. So they're going to be hanging around all over your body, and when they see something as bad is happening, they go to their local headquarters, which in the case of the body, that is the nearest lymph node. So remember, these cells are now a little bit angry, they know something is wrong, but what more importantly, they've also picked up parts of whatever microbe is causing the damage. So they've picked up that and they're going to take it to a lymph node. Now, I'm going to try and do an explanation of what happens in a lymph node now. It's a bit of an animation. Hopefully most of you will follow after I've talked to you first about the two main players that are in lymph nodes we need to talk about next. Again, more white blood cells. These are the ones called lymphocytes. And the two I'm talking about are T cells and B cells. I won't tell you what they do just yet, but they're the most important ones. There's something peculiar about these cells, and that each T or B cell can only respond to one tiny shape, and that is one tiny small part of a microbe. So, for example, the virus that causes COVID will be showing thousands of these tiny shapes to the immune system. We will have many, many millions of different T and B cells, but only a few will respond to any particular microbe. And that's why what happens, I'm going to show you happens next, is really important. Okay, so let's see if we can go here. So I want to talk about the infected tissue first. In the infected tissue, we've got this virus making all sorts of havoc going on, and it's going to end up with a dendritic cell here. It gets infected, or it gets picking up debris. And did you see it went all the way here to travel into the lymph node? Now, in the lymph node is particularly well organized so that this dendritic cell gets to speak to or to touch as many of these different lymphocytes as possible. Right? Now, I've color-coded this. So what this dendritic cell has got is something that's red, and it's not going to do anything to a green lymphocyte because there's no recognition. So the green lymphocyte will be there and it'll simply move on. However, if a red lymphocyte, so one has the right recognition, comes by, it will stick there and it does a couple things. First, it gets itself all excited and activated. And the other thing, it makes lots and lots and lots of copies of itself. So if ever you've noticed that your lymph nodes get swollen and sore when you have an infection, it's because all of these extra lymphocytes are growing, because it's literally growing an army to fight that infection, quite literally. Okay, so the next thing that has to happen is these lymphocytes come out of the lymph node and they go back to your tissue to start fighting the infection. That's the first thing. The second thing that's important is that after everything is over, you end up with more of these lymphocytes than you had before. So you are better able to fight that microbe if you ever see it again. Okay, so just a little bit more about the B cells or B lymphocytes, right? And I want to talk about those because they see microbes with a particular protein or receptor on their surface. And when they get activated, they do this interesting thing where they start throwing this receptor all out everywhere. So it's a protein that they throw out and that ends up in your bloodstream and everywhere. And it's that protein which is what we call antibody. And most of you will have heard of antibodies because that's what we're trying to do with the COVID vaccines, is make antibodies that recognize the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? Importantly, there are some special B cells at the end that home into, you have some tissue in big bones. So things like your thigh bone and in your pelvis, there's actually tissue inside that bone. And in there, some of these B cells will go and live forever, and they simply sit there and they pump out vast amounts of antibody. And that's where your bloodstream is full of different antibodies. It's like a collection of things that can stop any infection you've had in the past. Okay, and that's because those cells go there. Right, so what do these antibodies do? One thing you may have heard about is neutralizing virus. And that is simply, so I've got my antibody drawn here, and it's drawn stuck onto a bit of the virus. So this virus, to get into the cell, it needs to bind onto something on the cell, and this antibody is getting in the way. It's as simple as that. It's like, I don't know, putting blue tack or bubble gum over the key that the virus needs to get into a cell. But also, it can be like an eat me. Remember, we've got these Pac-Man type cells in the immune system. Antibody will help those cells see viruses and chew them up. And finally, if a viral protein is on the outside of a cell, these antibodies can be a target for other immune cells to come on and go and kill the cell. Because if a cell is infected by a virus, it essentially becomes a virus factory, and the body wants to shut down the virus factories. All right, so to give you an understanding of when all of those different things happen, hours to days after you have an infection, you start getting these chemical signals, and then all of these cells start rushing in. Okay, it will take you days to a week for that pathogen-specific army, which is T cells, either killers or B cells, to start making their antibody. But it takes a couple of weeks to get your full B cell response making lots and lots of antibodies, and these B cells to go sit down in your bone marrow and protect you in that way. Just one more word about T cells, which is important. We do know that these T cells, what their job is to go around the body. If they recognize what they see with their receptor, which is again a piece of a microbe, they can go and kill whatever cell that is. Right? And again, it's all about shutting down virus factories, shutting down cells that are making virus instead of doing what they should be doing. Okay, so after your infection, the vast majority of all these extra immune cells, they're just going to die off. The inflammation is going to subside. And actually, there are some other immune cells that come in and they help clean up. What's really important is that some T and B cells remain at greater number. And so this is memory. This is how our immune system remembers things. And this means the immune system will respond faster next time. So that happens to your T cells and some B cells. Importantly, you get these B cells called plasma cells that sit in your bone marrow, and they just keep on making their antibodies forever. Right? And that antibody gives you a heap of protection. All right, so how are we going for time now? So how vaccines work, and I would just like to kill, I've got something on my screen. I couldn't do that, okay. I wanted to remove something from my screen, but I'm still not competent in Zoom after a year of doing this, but let's see how we go. Right, so essentially what vaccines will do is they make the immune system think that it's under attack. All immune processes are engaged, so everything that I said happens, but it's really important to know it's less intensity. Now I've lost my pointer. The intensity is less, and it's directed at this fake invader. So the image I've got here, it's like a sheep in wolf clothing, if you like. So it trains the body to recognize something, but it doesn't cause any damage. The vaccine builds immune memory, and that's carried in antibodies and in extra T and B cells. So trying to put this together, I'm going to do this on a stone person, but let's talk about how the Pfizer vaccine works now. And again, I'll be going through all of those things that I just talked about for an ordinary immune response, but instead we're talking about the Pfizer vaccine. Right, so the Pfizer vaccine goes in your arm, and there is going to be some damage and danger at the vaccine's site. Without that, the vaccine won't work. And in fact, it's this process that means that some people might feel a bit crook the next day. It's actually not the vaccine doing anything particularly bad. It's actually the side effect, if you like, of your immune system getting cranked up. Some of the chemical messengers can give you some of those feelings. It can cause a little bit of fever. It can make you feel tired. All those things are your immune system getting started. So what the vaccine does is it just puts in the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And the way it does this is it uses an mRNA code. Just to show you what that looks like back into a picture of a cell again. Oh, sorry. And the reminder I want to say is this is a schematic of the whole SARS-CoV-2 virus. And all we're putting in this vaccine is just this spike, right? So if you hear anyone saying that the vaccine can cause you to be sick or have that disease or spread it to someone, it's clearly not true, because the only part of the SARS-CoV-2 in the whole vaccine is this one part. So it's a little bit like saying you can be run over by a car if that car only has the doors and there's no engine, there's no wheels, there's no nothing, right? Without all of this, the virus doesn't work, the disease doesn't work. But how do we get that? So mRNA vaccines are new technology, but actually very old biology. We've known that cells work like this for a very long time. And they use an mRNA that has a code for a spike. To get this mRNA into your body, it's packaged into tiny little lipid drops. You could even imagine them like soap bubbles, if you like, full of mRNA. Okay, and the other thing to remember is your cells are full of their own mRNA. So all we are doing with this vaccine is we add one extra instruction. So we're not really reprogramming the whole cell, we're just allowing the cell to make one more thing for us. Okay, so looking at that in the context of a cell, here is our lipid nanoparticle, that's what we call them in the fancy term. But anyway, it is going to deliver the mRNA into the cell. The mRNA will go into the factory in the cell, and it will cause that cell just to make the spike of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That spike can then be recognized by cells in the immune system. It may be made actually directly by these dendritic cells, but importantly, these dendritic cells can grab hold of that spike and take it from your arm into a lymph node. Right, so we go back to our stone person here. Those dendritic cell sentries will pick up or make the spike, okay? And they're going to move to the lymph node. In your lymph node, you will have B and T cells that recognize spike. They will expand, okay? And some of those B cells, after a while, hopefully will go off to your bone marrow. They will become these plasma cells I've talked about, and they'll make anti-spike antibody, and they'll make lots of it, and that will be very protective. Okay, at the end of everything, the damage and the danger and the spike, everything disappears. There's nothing left of the vaccine that you had. It's all gone. In fact, the dendritic cells, those sentries, they will be cleared. But what we know is we will be left with some anti-spike T and B cells. So they are T and B cells that are revved up, have seen the spike before, and they're at greater number than you had before. So they're ready to fight infection. And we're left with these guys in your bone marrow, which are going to pump out antibody. And remember, that antibody can then gum up any virus that's trying to come and invade your body. All right. I'm going to keep on moving on through here because I want to use the same type of way of explaining what happens in MS. So essentially in MS, we know that immunity has gone wrong. So instead of a bacteria or some microbe being recognized as foreign, unfortunately what happens is that myelin or other things in your brain, in your spinal cord, in your central nervous system, they get recognized as being foreign and they get attacked by the immune system. The truth is we don't really know exactly why or how this starts. There's a lot of theories. I just want to say that what I'm showing over here is more a general concept rather than this is what we know. But just to put all of those players in place, we know that there is inflammation in the central nervous system. We know that some parts of the nervous system get dragged by dendritic cells down to lymph nodes. We know that there is expansion of T and B cells that recognize parts of the immune system. We know that they end up going back into the nervous system and they do damage. Now, we also know that some of this whole process can actually go on in the brain itself, for example. We really don't know how it starts. There are a whole lot of theories. Some would say that there are some infections where the bits of the microbe look a little bit too much like our myelin, and that actually sets off the whole process. And in fact, what the immune system is trying to do is the right thing, but as an unfortunate consequence, it makes some things that also recognize our myelin. But what we do know is that all of the disease-modifying treatments, they all modify or suppress immunity. All the good treatments we have, they work somehow in this mess. And I want to go through those now a little bit, because again, that now connects whether people with MS and having these DMTs should be vaccinated. Oh, and spoiler alert, the answer is yes, they should be. Okay, so I want to try and go through all the different things that happen now. So firstly, the first class, I'm using the ones that I know you have here in New Zealand. Right, so the largest class of all of these DMTs, they do not cause general immunosuppression. So after many years of use, we know that people who are on these therapies are not more prone to infection. So we know that the immune response is pretty good. We know, for example, if you're taking these DMTs and you have a flu vaccine, that your response is actually going to be okay. All right, so just to say what we think they might do a little bit. So beta-ferron and Avonex, beta-ferron is one of the chemical messengers that we know happens very early in infection. Why giving this tends to dampen down immunity instead of turning it up is not entirely sure, but we think that it might change the balance a little bit. So there's a whole lot of complication I didn't talk to you about with lymphocytes. There's some lymphocytes that are very aggressive and they attack, but there's other lymphocytes that actually tell everyone to calm down, it's all okay, right? And there's slightly different types. And we know that this balance gets disturbed by, and in a way that's good for people with MS, with beta-ferron and Avonex. We also know that Copaxone does a little bit of this, but Copaxone also seems to alter some of these cells that start off the whole process that interact with our lymphocytes. Okay, so Aubagio reduces the expansion of all your lymphocytes just a little bit. It probably messes with the balance of those a little bit as well, but it doesn't reduce the number of them so much that it inhibits your ability to fight infection. Tecfidera, again, seems to mess with the balance. Now, you might be thinking I'm saying messes with the balance quite a lot. And well, the truth is that it's a bit of a catch-all for when we know things alter immunity, but we don't really quite know how. And I'm sure that we'll get to a better understanding at some point. But right now, this is the best we know. What's really important is we know that they work really well from clinical trials. Right. So I want to go to the next few because they're much clearer in what they do. Okay, so Tysabri, this is an infusion, and this infusion actually stops your lymphocytes from getting into your brain and into your spinal cord. So they block into access of your lymphocytes into your central nervous system, and that way they stop MS, because if these can't get in, they can't damage the nervous system. But because they're only stopping lymphocytes getting into the nervous system, in general, they are not immunosuppressive. By contrast, Gilenya is a little bit immunosuppressive. What this does is stops any of your B and T cells from getting very far out of your lymph nodes. Some do, but a lot of them get blocked there, right? And so we know that people who take Gilenya can be more susceptible to some infections. Okay, and that is because the immune system doesn't work quite as well as it should, because these cells get trapped in lymph nodes. Ocrevus works quite differently. In fact, what Ocrevus does is wipes out all of your B cells. So it literally takes out a whole fraction of your lymphocytes. And so you can't make new B cell responses. An important thing to understand, remember, I told you you've got special B cells that sit in your bone marrow and make antibody. Ocrevus doesn't touch those. So all of the immune memory you have from those cells in your bone marrow don't get removed by Ocrevus. They're all still there and they can protect you against all of those things from the past. However, it means you can't make new B cell responses. You can't make new antibodies. Okay, so the majority of our DMTs do not impact vaccines. So there is no evidence of reduced vaccine function for beta-ferrin, Avanex, Capaxone, Aubagio, Tecfidera, Tysabri. Okay? And again, there's a really good analog. We know that they don't make you more prone to infections. That means your immune system is working just fine. Okay, the last two may have an impact. So Gilenya, as I said, we know that it impacts lymphocyte movement, and that's probably going to be required for the best vaccine response. So it is going to have an impact. So yeah, it can stop movement. The advice we have is if you're using this and it's controlling your MS, you want to keep going with it, okay? But get the vaccine anyway, because you will still get some response. It's probably not going to be as good as it would be if you weren't taking Gilenya. If you have not started and you're considering starting and it's not urgent, and again, that's a conversation you have to have with your neurologist, you could consider a delay until 2 weeks after your second vaccine dose. And remember that, you might remember that timeline that I gave you, but that will give the vaccine time to do all the things it needs to do to make all your memory B cells and T cells to make all those antibodies. So the other one, which is kind of easier to understand even, is Ocrevus. So when you have an infusion with Ocrevus, and that's the DMT that I use myself, essentially you have no B cells. They're just not there. Right. We do know our T cell responses are completely unaffected. They're not affected. And although I haven't talked so much about it, because we don't talk about T cell responses from vaccines so much, they may well be protective. And I know a really great immunologist in California, he thinks that actually the T cells, even if you have no B cells at all, there's some evidence that the T cells are likely to protect you from severe disease and death from COVID. And I'm quite happy with his evidence and the argument he makes. Okay, so again, I am on Ocrevus. I have been vaccinated, and I've been vaccinated because even if I have no B cells at all, I think it's worthwhile for the T cell response. There's an official recommendation that says you want to time your vaccination, if that's possible, to 12 weeks after an infusion with Ocrevus. I didn't do that myself, and I'm not entirely convinced. The idea with Ocrevus infusions is actually the infusions are close enough together that you never really have enough B cells, and that's to keep protecting you from your MS. In some people, we do know that B cells return a little bit faster, so I guess it will be the case for some people. If they wait a little bit after an infusion, they may make some more of a B cell response. Again, if you're considering starting Ocrevus and it's not considered urgent, you may consider a delay of 2 to 4 weeks after your second vaccine dose. Remember, Ocrevus won't touch those B cells that are sitting in your bone marrow making antibodies, right? And so the antibodies against COVID will be there with all your other great immune memories, even if you then start Ocrevus and you take out the rest of your B cells. Right, so that was a whole lot of information, and I hope that's been useful for some people. I am happy to, of course, answer questions in Q&A afterwards, but here's my summary of my take-home message. Right, COVID vaccines, including Pfizer, which is what you have over in New Zealand, are safe and effective. I didn't say this, but we are monitoring people with MS as a specific group, as an internationally, and there is no evidence that there is any additional risks for people with MS in general. So there's no particular adverse events that people with MS need to be concerned about over the general population. And there's nothing about having MS that means that the vaccines may be less effective for MS, if that makes sense. I would urge everyone to resist vaccine misinformation. A lot of the misinformation I've seen has a bunch of science words, but frankly, when you put them together, they are nonsense. They sound very authoritative. They sound like they make sense, but they're not. So I would urge you, if you get a message, whether that's by a text message or it's on some social media, and the overall message contradicts medical or official advice, no matter how many fancy science words, be very, very skeptical. And I hope some of the things that I've explained today help you understand. So I'll give you a classic example is this idea that mRNA can mess with your genome somehow, that it gets into your genome. I hope I showed you today that mRNA is on a one-way trip in your cell away from the DNA. And when we use an mRNA vaccine, that mRNA doesn't go anywhere near your DNA. It can't even get into the nucleus where your DNA is. So it's a physical impossibility for the mRNA to somehow get into your genome and mess with it. It just doesn't work. Right, the other important messages are that most DMTs have no impact on COVID vaccines. You should just go and grab them straight away. These two, Gilenya and Ocrevus, will lead to reduced responses. There's no increased risk associated with having the vaccine, even though you have these. The issue is that your response might not be as good, probably won't be as good as if you're on one of the other treatments or you have no treatment at all. But vaccination, importantly, vaccination is still recommended. And again, I want to be clear that my money is where my mouth is. I have MS, I'm treated with Ocrevus, and I'm becoming vaccinated. I think that's all I have to say, and I hope I can clear up any more questions later. I hope that's been useful.
Thank you very much, David. That was very, very interesting. Thank you. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions when we come to the panel later on in the session. Just a reminder, if anyone's got any questions, any burning questions, just add them to the chat area, and then we can refer back to them later, just so they don't get forgotten at all. Wonderful. Okay, Audrey, I will hand over to you to lead the next part.
Thank you, Amanda Rose. Thank you, David. That was really interesting. So I really appreciated it. I feel like I've got a bit of a lesson in not only, you know, how the vaccine works in your system, but also how it might affect somebody that has MS. So it was really interesting. I note that Beth has come onto the call, so welcome along, Beth. Beth is one of the people working on the vaccine strategy, and I don't know if you want to say anything at all, Beth, but we'll let you, you know, gather your thoughts and be in the background. You'll be part of our panel, I imagine. But it's my pleasure right now to welcome Ray Finch. And Ray has been so kind as to support the Ministry of Health in their vaccine strategy and ensuring that we roll it out properly for disabled people in our community. So Ray has, you've worked so hard, and we are so grateful because you've been part of all our engagement, stakeholder engagement groups, but also at the forefront of ensuring that we absolutely ensure that disabled people are part of, or at the centre of, what we're doing in terms of the vaccine rollout. I'm not going to say much more. I'm going to pass over to Ray because he's going to be doing a presentation on some of the work he's doing and a summary of where we're at. So thank you, Ray.
Thanks very much, Audrey. Good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me fine. All good? Great. So yes, Ray Finch, Taka Ingawa. I hail from the sunny South Africa. Been in New Zealand for a good 6 years now, and I did one good thing, and that was marry a New Zealand girl. So she was able to bring me over here and join the land of the long white cloud. in my day job is I run an organization that supports people with significant disabilities. It's called Spectrum Care. I'm the Chief Operating Officer, and I was very humbled to be asked to join the Ministry of Health on a secondment for what started off for a couple of weeks. It ended up to being just over 2 months to work with Beth and Audrey and a group of really passionate people at the Ministry of Health to work on a plan for the disabled community of New Zealand. And it was really heartening to see that the disabled community are receiving an equitable lens, the lens of equity, alongside Maori and Pacifica and the rest of New Zealand. And it was, coming from an organization where and Audrey knows us well, we're always fighting the fight and advocating strongly for people with disabilities. I was strongly warmed to the fact that people with disabilities are being given the due consideration in the sequencing framework, in the approaches that we've proposed to the Ministry of Health in order to meet people's needs and to apply a level of consideration in those approaches, so that people's voices are heard and that they are at the center of the planning and development of the rollout of the vaccine. So I've got a short presentation. I'm not going to, I was going to try and shit from the hip, David, and speak from the cuff, but after your amazing presentation, I thought I'd better have put up a few slides up there. So I'll just share my screen in a second and go to the slide and present this guy there. Okay. Present to you. So right. So I mean, as David mentioned, the vaccine is not inserting a virus into your body. It's essentially, in layman's terms, and I'll keep it less clinical and less laboratory talk for those of you out there that might appreciate that. But it's the vaccine is working to teach your body to know how to identify the virus and then how to build up its ability to fight that virus. Things that we'd like to point out, and that's certainly the media will often love to make mention of are we behind schedule, or there's a number of challenges in the way. Certainly, it is the largest vaccination rollout that New Zealand has ever faced, or the world has ever faced, and with that comes supply and demand challenges. But there is going to be enough Pfizer vaccine for everybody in New Zealand who wants to be vaccinated. It's certainly not mandatory. It is a voluntary vaccination, but we have secured enough Pfizer vaccination over the next few months for everybody in New Zealand who wants to have a vaccination to get one. As David mentioned, it contains no virus itself. It can't give you COVID-19. And obviously everybody for the Pfizer one in particular needs two doses of that vaccine, and typically 21 days apart. We often get a lot of questions about is it safe? And absolutely, look, look, New Zealand was in a very fortunate position. We have been one of the countries that have managed the COVID outbreak extremely well. We've been, I suppose, being a small little country in the far corner of the earth has made, and surrounded by water, has made us a lot safer than if we were a country in the middle of Europe. So we did have the opportunity to take our time to understand which is going to be the best vaccine for MedSafe to do the necessary checks and to be not at the bleeding edge, but at the cutting edge of the vaccination rollout. We can assure you that MedSafe has taken no shortcuts. However, you should talk to your doctor and take the advice of the likes of David and your neurologist that you're speaking with before you have the vaccine, if you have any questions and concerns. On the day that you have the vaccine, there's naturally going to be a number of questions, so it'll be really good for yourself or your whānau to prepare a dossier of your medical information to take with you for your vaccine. So the vaccinators will be tasked to fully understand your clinical support needs on the day, and ensure that you are not placing yourself at any risk of having the vaccine, understanding what all your other medications are that you're currently taking, and if there's any if you have any treatments or medications in the weeks leading up to the vaccine, aligned to what David had mentioned. After your vaccination, you're going to be asked to stay on premises under observation for up to 20 minutes post the vaccine. And then that second injection is going to be within 21 days later, at least 21 days later. Side effects, David mentioned a few, but really it is your body getting your immune system started that gives you some of those side effects. The sore arm is typically from the injection itself, but a fever or a headache is something that is quite typical. We have had a few reports of people saying that the second vaccination had their symptoms are slightly more pronounced, and they didn't experience any in the first vaccination, but it is certainly a normal side effect, and people could be aware of that. What do we still not know? I mean, I suppose it's been a few short months, and as more and more research is done, we will know more, but we don't at this stage know how long the vaccination will work for. There might well be a necessity in the future for a top-up to or a booster shot. They're already talking about in the UK, as various strains are uncovered. There might well be a need for further vaccinations, and this is obviously a moving feast, the COVID outbreak. So, but what we don't understand right now is how long this vaccine will work for. Will the vaccine stop someone from passing on COVID-19? That is still not 100% known to this stage. We do know that it is a particulate virus, and you could carry it on your clothing or on your hands, hence the reason for your infection prevention and control measures and your healthy hygiene measures, but that is still not entirely known yet. And then there's a reluctance to vaccinate children under the age of 16. So for now, it's anybody 16 years or older, and that is to do with the number of documented research that's taking place around the world to understand how young the vaccine could be administered. What about other vaccines? I'll let David has spoken to the various MS treatments out there and what the advice is there, and absolutely directing you to your neurologist if you're in the middle of a treatment cycle. But your flu vaccines and MMR vaccine, which is absolutely, it's now June, and flu vaccine season is certainly upon us. And we do encourage everybody to protect yourself from the flu. If you haven't made a booking yet for a vaccine or been approached by a DHB, we would strongly encourage you to get your flu vaccine. Don't delay it by 3 or 4 weeks and you end up in the middle of winter, in the middle of the flu season. But there is a 2-week waiting period between having your flu vaccine and receiving the COVID vaccine. However, the moment you have your COVID vaccine, you've got 3 weeks to wait before your second one, and then 2 weeks before you could have the flu or the MMR vaccine. So you're 5 weeks away at least. So if there is the opportunity to have the flu vaccine today, given where we are in the rollout, we would strongly encourage people to have their flu vaccine and protect yourself from the flu. So how is the rollout going? It's probably the question on a lot of people's lips. We obviously started with the area in the country where is the most at risk of a community outbreak from occurring, and that's in our border workers and our MIQ. We then looked at those that are most at risk of catching COVID virus, and vaccinating them. So the border workers, MIQ workers, the managed isolation workers, and their families were vaccinated back in March. Those at risk of catching it would then immediately be those frontline clinical staff, and then immediately thereafter is those that are at risk of getting very sick if they caught the virus, and then beyond that is everybody else in Aotearoa. So if you're watching this whether it's a recording or if you're watching it live today, as a family member of someone that has multiple sclerosis, or as a family member of someone that has a disability, the Ministry of Health has recognised from the very beginning, as when I started, that all people with a disability typically have multiple comorbidities or other complications, and then if you have a disability, that we do need to sequence people in a sequence that will allow for those that are at higher risk of getting sick from COVID to be sequenced earlier than the general population. You may have seen this slide or this PDF on the Ministry of Health website. It's quite a busy one. I'll just talk really briefly to it. It identifies 4 groups within the New Zealand population. Group 1 was the border workers and MIQ workers, and we're currently in Group 2 at the moment. So it started off with all of those frontline healthcare workers and people that support vulnerable people. So the care and support workers in the world where I work in the disability sector, all of the support workers that support the very people with significant disability support needs, and all of those frontline healthcare workers, as well as then all people with a disability that live in long-term residential care and or receive multiple support from multiple staff on a daily basis in order to live a normal life, like most of us on this call. So the sequencing framework was worked on the basis of an impact and likelihood. So naturally, anybody with a disability, we've identified that there's the impact, regardless of your disability, is significant. The likelihood of someone living in a congregate care environment, in a residential care model, so aged care facilities or disability support environments, or mental health services, where the people are forced, because of their disability or the way they present, are living in communal settings. The likelihood of contracting it, because they're typically the bubble in that environment is 6 to 8 staff and 3 to 4 people living together. It becomes quite a big bubble. So hence they were sequenced into Group 2, and then immediately thereafter, which in some of the smaller centres has already started, in Group 3, and that is the rest of the population of New Zealand that are over the age of 65 or have any disability or any medical concerns that have been indicated that there would be complications. So those are things like high blood pressure, and there's a list of more up-to-date medical diagnoses that will allow people to be sequenced into Group 3. The part of the puzzle that I was working on for two months, and I, as I said, I came into the COVID vaccination program sitting alongside the equity team, which is where I played. So I was part of the equity team, and like I mentioned, we were working alongside the Maori and Pacifica team to ensure that there was an equity lens for all people with disabilities alongside the rest of New Zealand. And what we did was we needed to identify who this target population were. How would we identify who they were? And immediately it became clear that we needed to engage with the wider sector. And that's where the likes of Amanda Rose and this group came to being, because yes, we understand where a very small targeted population is within a confined service like the disability support environment, but we certainly needed to reach out to a really wide group. And it was the immediate group was a group of 44 contributors, and since Audrey's additional engagement group has widened that reach, so we have been able to have a significant contribution from various NGOs and organizations and peak bodies that are representing a wider disability population, to identify how we would reach those people when the time came. We needed to ensure that we could collaborate across that sector, so that for people, staff, family carers and carers knew and understood what the preparation work that needed to take place. How would we be able to ensure that people's consent has been documented appropriately, that no person in New Zealand is coerced or forced to have the vaccine, that it is absolutely a voluntary exercise, that people need to understand what they're consenting to, and that they have the right to say no. The accurate demographic and segmentation of that information is very crucial. As you can understand, the Pfizer vaccine is a very hot sought after commodity worldwide. We certainly don't want to waste any of that vaccine, and we're needing to overlay the ability to roll out with the population's readiness to receive the vaccine with the availability of the vaccine. So there was a team of 6 or 7 really clever guys, a lot cleverer than me, that needed to work out the sequencing framework around what was the logistics to get the Pfizer vaccine into the country at the right pace, so that none of it was wasted, and it didn't reach its use by date at the same time as it could be accurately distributed to where it needed to be, where people needed it. So in terms of disability considerations, look, there was certainly over the last 3 months a number of inquiries from various peak bodies, and I think the first time I met Amanda was in an inquiry from her to understand what is the Ministry of Health and the COVID plan doing to consider people with multiple sclerosis. And absolutely, that's where the likes of David come in to advise from a clinical perspective if there are any specific risks and advice that could be shared with this population. But certainly the ability to identify what the wider disability community's impact would be. We know that if a person has a disability or a condition, there are multiple comorbidities, and New Zealand's government does not want to leave any soldiers out there. To ensure that anybody with a disability or a condition that places them at risk are sequenced ahead of the general population will give us a sense of comfort that in the event of another community outbreak, that the most vulnerable of our population have been sequenced accordingly, that we could be assured that people are given the best possible protection. So within group 2 or tier 2, as I call it, where we've got just on 14,000 people with significant disabilities that need daily care by paid service providers, another just under 10,000 people with a mental health diagnosis who live in residential care, together with a really large group of just on 150,000 people that are over the age of 65 living in residential settings. Quickly jumping across to group 3 is well over 700,000, which is nearly probably a quarter of the New Zealand population that are eligible for the vaccine, will be in group 3. The process, I'll get to the process in a second. Let me jump across to here. The process and the approaches for the various vaccine deliveries is very much linked to a person's specific needs. So under group 2 and then easing across to group 3. In group 2, that very specific population that require a specific approaches, we've been able to advocate for, starting at the bottom of this slide, home bubble approaches. So if there's an individual that is unable to leave their home for whatever reason, there's certainly the ability of a DHB to accommodate the very pinnacle of a delivery service, which would be a home vaccination service. We have advocated strongly and have success in ensuring that temporary sites which meet the needs of a population that might be slightly removed from the larger community sites, so the rural communities would be able to receive vaccines in their communities, in the temporary spaces that might be more familiar with them, such as day programs or card clubs or social community gatherings, groups that normally get together. So across Aotearoa, if there are organizations that regularly bring people together for sharing of stories and breaking bread, so to speak. So the maraes and the churches would all be seen as temporary sites which the DHBs are gearing up to deliver to in a very safe and secure space that gives people a sense of comfort and a sense of community, so that we stand the best chance of success there. We do also have, I think just in the last week, there's been a number of GP clinics that have been stood up now as well. So, and those will continue to roll out. GPs will be a potential vaccination site for people if you have a trusted GP, and that would be the approach that you'd like to take. over the next number of months, more and more GPs, it is obviously up to them, and in order to take on the tasks, typically they're starting with the larger GP practices, but GPs will certainly be an option for people to receive their vaccine. It is ultimately, though, up to the size of the GP and the capacity to manage the logistics of that. And then the last one, which is the most common, and those that are largely set up at the moment, is our fixed community vaccination centres. Within these centres are all the necessary support and accommodation provisions for people with disabilities. So the process when in group 3, which is, I would assume, is the majority of the people watching this video conference, when group 3 launches in your region, there'll be a lot of targeted communications and mainstream media, and an opportunity for you as a family member or a person with multiple sclerosis to engage with the DHB through an online booking/registration system. And within that environment, you would be able to identify what your support and accommodation needs are for the vaccination sites. That process will lead you through to a number of available sites and dates for you to choose, and it'll also at the same time inform the vaccination site what those support and accommodation needs are. So just a really brief slide. So across the whole of New Zealand, you can see for over the next month or two, there's just 13,500 people with significant disabilities that are going to be vaccinated in very specific person-centered ways. And then over the next month and a half, almost, 70 times the amount of people are able to be vaccinated as this capacity that Audrey mentioned grows within the rollouts. Probably most importantly, from a significant disability perspective, and there might be people watching this video conference that have concerns about consent. One of the biggest things biggest challenges that we faced at the moment I joined the Ministry of Health COVID team was to ensure that people were never coerced or vaccinated without their consent. And what we were able to do, it's available at the moment on the Ministry of Health website in easy read format. We were able to, and with the help of People First, develop 3 different guidelines for a supported decision-making framework. So if you have a look on the Ministry of Health website, as well as or People First, who the organization that we contracted to help us build this, I wouldn't say groundbreaking, but is certainly challenging the rhetoric of ensuring that people with disabilities are afforded the right to speak for themselves, even when they typically aren't always able to. A supported decision-making framework allows a person with a limited communicative ability or a diminished cognitive ability to still, with support, make an informed decision and demonstrate that they've consented to that. There might be people watching this call who have a family member that is unable to communicate and would want to demonstrate to the vaccinator that their loved one has consented to the vaccine. It is certainly a human right to consent and to make your own choices, and the supported decision-making guidelines would help you do so. Guideline D is for those people that are even despite applying three very focused supported decision-making options, is the application of right 7 of the Health and Disability Code of Rights. And that is an ability to, even if there's somebody that is unable to communicate at all and unable to demonstrate that they understand what they're consenting to, that there is still the opportunity for a person to receive the vaccine by a consultative process with people that have got a interest in the well-being of the individual. So there's a number of steps there that is that we're working through to ensure that vaccinators don't inadvertently vaccinate somebody that hasn't been able to demonstrate that they consent. You can imagine the number of vulnerable people out there that could, in a a non-New Zealand country be coerced or forced to receive the vaccine, and it's certainly not something that the Ministry of Health is advocating for. So if you have a look on the Ministry of Health website, there's a number of easy read tools, and when Beth and I and people first developed these tools, we thought it would be for a very specific focused audience. But we've just recently learned from the clinical team that they wanted to use it wider, because it's almost regardless of language or culture or creed, the way these tools allow someone to understand what they're consenting to, what's in it for them, what the benefits are, what the risks are, in a really simple, concise manner. I'd encourage anybody to have a look on the website and look for a supported decision-making tool. You'd be surprised how much you learn by reading less and looking at pictures a lot more. So please feel free to have a look at those on the Ministry of Health website. I'll jump through that. I suppose the big question on a lot of people's minds is, how will I know when it's my time to be vaccinated? So look, there's Beth and her team are part of the disability focused communications and engagement team. There are going to be targeted communications out through this engagement group that Amanda Rose is part of. So the moment the various geographies or DHB regions are ready to vaccinate into group 3 of the vaccination plan, if that's where you fall into, if you're not living in a long-term residential setting at the moment, Amanda would be communicating out to her audience, and no doubt if you're on this video call, you are receiving her communications, but as well as the wider mainstream media. So there will be opportunities for you to engage, declare that you have a disability, answer the questions that will allow the vaccinator to prepare for your vaccine, and slot in your vaccination events, thereby protecting yourself, protecting your whānau, and protecting the team of 5 million in New Zealand. So we certainly do encourage all people to have a vaccine, but like I said, it is absolutely voluntary, and we wouldn't want anybody to be coerced into receiving it. So by all means, you can have a look on both websites, health.govt.nz as well as covid19.govt.nz, are the two websites where, provided you've happy to scroll down or click a few times, there's a wealth of information on there, with more and more information coming out in easy read, in multiple languages, as well as a number of videos that I'm really excited to see. I've had a few of the people that I support in Wellington have put their hands up with Beth and recently done a few videos, which I'm looking forward to seeing out and about in YouTube. So look, I think that's probably it from me from a presentation perspective, but I'm looking forward to some of the questions.
Thank you very much, Ray. That was really informative. We've obviously just got about 15 minutes left, just under. So I think we should probably speed through some questions, unless Beth or Audrey, if there's anything you wanted to add from a ministry perspective.
Not from me. Thank you, Ray. Hopefully, that was really informative. I suppose just one little comment is we're learning all the time, so feedback and questions are good for us. So yeah, please feel free in the next few minutes to ask any burning questions.
Yep, no, nothing else from me, Amanda. David, I found your presentation absolutely enlightening. I have to confess that I didn't know a great deal about the intricacies of MS, so I know just enough to be dangerous now, I think.
And I'd also like to welcome Dr. John Mottershead, who is an MS specialist at the Southern DHB in Dunedin, who may be able to answer some of the questions from a more kind of clinical New Zealand perspective if they come up. So I'll just run through the questions and see, and hopefully we can get through most of them. The first question that I see keeps coming up is just to confirm that yes, people with MS are considered in group 3. That has been now confirmed by the ministry, and we'll be putting out a notice around that tomorrow, along with the recording of this video. One question that we had coming up was around relapses. Can a person having a relapse and taking no medications have the vaccine without further complications? John or David, would you have any knowledge on that one at all?
That one's for John.
Okay. I should have thought that it wouldn't be a problem. And if there's an expectation that there might be a long delay if you try to reschedule, then I think probably it would be better to have the COVID vaccine during the relapse rather than make a big delay in being vaccinated.
Great. David, I see you answered this one in the comments, but just in case for anyone who might watch the video afterwards, someone's asked that they mentioned that they're on alemtuzumab, which they got 4 years ago, and just wondering where that sits in within the DMT spectrum. Obviously, alemtuzumab isn't available here, but we often have a lot of people coming from overseas.
Yeah, so I answered that one. That's so alemtuzumab is one of these therapies we think about as resetting the immune system. So it takes out a large number of your lymphocytes, but then they slowly come back over time. And the idea is hopefully you take out those ones that are causing MS, but you get back other ones. And I'd say 4 years after alemtuzumab, you should be responding pretty much like anyone to a vaccine. Would you agree with that, John, or do you not think about alemtuzumab because you don't have to give it?
We don't think about it all that much because we don't have access to it, but certainly the advice from the National MS Society in USA was wait 24 weeks after a dose, and ideally have the vaccine at least 4 weeks before the next infusion, which
right.
seems a bit, yeah.
And 4 years later is a long time after that. And it would be the same for cladribine, if anyone's had cladribine, because they're from elsewhere.
Great, thank you. An ocrelizumab user has asked, should they have the vaccine now or wait 3 months? They're due to have their next infusion soon. So is it better to have your COVID vaccine as early as possible or wait?
I would say I just had my vaccine. From what I know, what ocrelizumab does for most people, they won't get their B cells back before they have their next infusion. That's what the evidence suggests. Some people might. So I decided that as someone with ocrelizumab, the thing that I really want is a good T cell response. It doesn't matter when I have my ocrelizumab, I'll still make a T cell response. So I just had it, but John may have a different view.
So I wondered privately about the same question, and I think if you follow the guidance from sort of expert bodies, they say wait 12 weeks after the last infusion and have the second one at least 4 weeks before the next. But I agree that we wouldn't expect B cell populations to have come back in between 6 monthly ocrelizumab infusions, so may have come back a little bit. There probably won't be a big difference. If there were a completely flexible system, then yes, I would follow those timing guidelines. But if you've again got some expectation or anxiety that there may be a long delay before return, then I would probably go for it.
Thank you. Someone who is on ocrelizumab, Audrey, Beth and Ray, this might be one for you. So obviously, as you've heard, those with ocrelizumab have the B cells get depleted. They've said, can their family in their household receive the vaccine early alongside them for better herd immunity, therefore protecting them better?
I could answer that if you'd like. Yeah,
really good question, Amanda.
Great question, and a good strategy for families with vulnerable people to have. So at the registration stage, to indicate to the vaccinators or the DHB that the family's doing it together, and it would certainly be supported. The DHBs do have the ability to exercise discretion. But with a really simple argument like that, because of the person's vulnerabilities, we don't expect that to be declined at all. Certainly is an easy one to get across the line.
Yeah, the only caveat that I would put around that would be the supply that the DHB had available at the time. So it depends how the booking has gone through, but you know, we extract as many doses out of a vial of Pfizer vaccine as we possibly can, and sometimes we have some spare, and so in some instances there might be, you know, someone who took someone else in to get their appointment was saying, well, would you like to get vaccinated at the same time? And that's just, you know, sometimes we manage to get 7 doses out of a vial, sometimes we only manage to get 5. So it depends, you know, on the quantities that they have available at the time. But certainly if it's able to be done, then we would be looking to do that at the same time for exactly that reason, yes.
Thank you. We've also got a question, should pregnant women get the vaccine?
Really, really good question. Our advice at the moment is if a pregnant person is in an at-risk group, then it would be really good for them to have a talk to their medical professional about whether that would work for them. Right now, the advice is that if you were pregnant and you were at a very low risk, then again, you can talk to your medical advisor about that, but waiting until the end of your pregnancy would be the advice at this stage.
Thank you. What impact would a measles vaccination have along with the COVID vaccination?
We do ask that there's a gap between measles and flu vaccines. I think Ray touched on that when he was saying before. So if you get offered a flu vaccine and a COVID vaccine, or a measles vaccine and a COVID vaccine around the same sort of time, we ask that people prioritise the COVID vaccine over the others. And there does need to be a gap between the vaccines so that we can make sure that if anyone has an adverse reaction to them, we know which vaccine they're reacting to. So that's very important. So if you're looking at flu, then it needs to be 2 weeks before a COVID vaccine first dose and 2 weeks after the second COVID vaccine dose. With MMR, you need a little bit more of a lead time at the start. So it's 4 weeks before the first dose of COVID, and after your second dose of COVID, wait 2 weeks before you have your MMR.
Thank you. Obviously, this is a question that we talked about earlier as well, which probably plays more into the relation around Ocrevus and the B cells depleting and the T cells, as you mentioned, David, still creating a response. But one question is, are people able to get a blood test to check how effective the COVID-19 vaccination has been?
I can answer that technically and say, technically, yes, if it's an antibody response. Practically, most places are not doing it because we actually don't know yet what level you need on an antibody test to know that you're protected. So that's number one. So people might think that they're bulletproof and they're actually not. And one thing we haven't said that is, even if you're infected, if you're somewhere where there's COVID about, or in any case, you still need to take all the precautions. It's really important that we don't think that this vaccine is going to make us superhuman. And I think, just to echo something I think Ray mentioned, that the evidence to how well it stops us perhaps spreading the virus to someone else, that's still out there to be determined. So we've got really strong evidence for protection against severe disease, but we have less good evidence about how much. We know from studies now in the UK there is protection from those around you, but exactly how good that is, we don't know, and it's not looking like 100%. So protect those around you and take those precautions. So to get back to the question then, we had a very long discussion in the International MS Federation about this. There are some countries that seem to like doing lots of these tests. The general consensus from people around the world was to leave it alone, because information that's not especially reliable can be worse than no information at all. It's difficult to interpret what you would get from that information. So and we don't know what to do. So for example, if you're on Gilenya and you didn't make a very high antibody response, we actually don't know whether it's worth coming back with another vaccine or not. So it's information, we don't know what to do with it. So by and large, people aren't going to do it. And I suspect the people from the ministry there would say they're not doing it.
I just wanted to also just raise on the previous question that we had around the measles vaccination, just to note that people with MS are not recommended to get the measles vaccine because it's a live attenuated vaccine. Obviously, you would be considering getting it before you're starting a DMT. Am I right there, John?
Yes, that's right. So there isn't a universal way of doing this, but we're moving towards, in our unit, testing people to see whether they're immune to measles, mumps and rubella before starting disease-modifying treatments. And then if they're not, then talking to them about whether they should or shouldn't be vaccinated prior to starting a disease-modifying treatment.
Thank you. And then another question that's come in from a couple of angles, and we might only have time for this last one, is if you live with MS but you're not taking any disease-modifying treatments, could the vaccine have any adverse effect?
Simple answer is no. And I know that people are collecting the data internationally and there's no signal there at all either, but there's no biological reason why. And again, but we still look. That's a really important message. Even though we never dismiss any possibility of anything, we always look hard and we're always making sure that we track down anything, but there's no signal there either.
Great, thank you. And I think we just have maybe time for one more. Would having the COVID vaccine give better protection for someone on Ocrevus DMT rather than not having it at all?
I'm saying yes.
Agreed.
I agree. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think that's probably all we have time for today. We're at 7:30. If there's any questions that we haven't been able to answer that are pressing, please do contact MSNZ at info@msnz.org.nz. I'll be emailing everyone who joined this with a copy of this recording and also with our contact details and an update regarding the Group 3 classification. But I just want to thank Ray, David, Audrey, Beth and John for all joining. I know I've learned a lot. I hope everyone attending online has learned a lot. And I think there's a few of the panelists who feel that they've learned a bit. So that was fantastic. Thank you very much.
All right.
Right, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.